Well, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at Unit 2, which is focused on Chapter 2 from our Harmer textbook, and that is on teachers. So you should have read Chapter 2 before you came to watch this lecture. So if you haven't, just go ahead and stop the video and take that time to read the chapter and then come on back. As we get started here, I want us to think for a minute about what does it make to be a good teacher? How do we describe a good teacher? Did you ever have a favorite teacher? Maybe from elementary school or high school? Why was that person your favorite teacher? Think about the things that made that teacher so special and important to you. Do you think that people are born good teachers, or that a person can become a good teacher? Are they born or are they made? Well, we are going to be looking at some important traits of good teachers today. We're going to be thinking about a number of things, like even what do they look like? How do they dress? How do they present themselves? How do they behave? How do they react to students and situations? We're going to consider the question of, do we become actually different people as in our teacher roles to some extent when we're in front of the classroom? Are we a different person when we're in that space? So students consistently identify that if they enjoy a class, it's usually because they like the person who's teaching that class more than they really especially enjoy the lesson. The person comes through in the lesson, and that really has to do with the trait of being a genuine person. Really good teachers are genuine. This is probably the most valued trait that we can think of when it comes to a teacher of any kind, and certainly an English language teacher as well. Some personalities of teachers are sort of larger than life and really gregarious and attract people to them. Others have a sort of quiet authority, and their comportment can be quite different. There's no one ideal teacher personality. And like I said before, we may take on a different persona when we're teaching in a different way than when we aren't. We may be sort of a blend of who we really are and who we are as teachers. But we should always be presenting a professional persona, both in terms of our dress and in terms of our comportment. That doesn't mean conforming to some kind of stereotype of a stuffy teacher with the sort of glasses down her nose and very buttoned up. But it does mean that you exude a persona of someone who should be taken seriously by their students. I want you to think for a minute about how specifically can a student determine that a teacher is genuine, that their teacher is being a genuine person to them. That's going to be one of the questions that you'll respond to on the discussion board for Unit 2 today, so think about that. Another important trait of a good teacher is adaptability. The ability to react to different events in the classroom as the lesson progresses. Sometimes there are unexpected things that can happen that mean our learning objectives aren't going to be met, or they're not going to be met in the way that we anticipated. And students really pick up, either subconsciously or consciously, on whether we remain rigid and unable to shift gears, or if we are more able to pivot and adapt to what's happening. Think for a moment about what are some of those unexpected events that can happen in the classroom that might cause a teacher to have to adapt. That also is going to be one of the questions that you'll respond to on our discussion board for day 2. Another very important trait of a teacher is the ability to establish rapport. Rapport is really the relationship between students and teacher. And to some extent, it's about how much the relationship that the teacher sort of engenders between students as well, the kind of classroom culture that a teacher can um, sort of cultivate. Rapport, it has to do with the perception of the students of what the teacher thinks of those students and how those students feel treated. Our interactions between our students and us as teachers should always be positive. They should be enjoyable, as well as respectful. So what do those kind of interactions look like in the classroom? Think specifically about what it looks like if a teacher has established good rapport with their students. And that's going to be the third part of your discussion board responses today. Part of building rapport is recognizing your students. So how do we do that? Well, one important way that we can recognize our students is by knowing their names, by knowing about those students, about maybe their families, their backgrounds, their interests, things that are specific to our students. Just remembering them when they, maybe after they're no longer our students and they come back to the school, or we see them in the hallway, just being able to continue to maintain some kind of relationship with them. That speaks even to our current students, seeing that we continue to have a recognition and remembrance of our previous students. Rapport is also built by listening to our students. How do we do that? Well, one way that we can listen to our students is to show them that we are interested in what they are saying. So we make eye contact with them. We come down to their level if they are a smaller person than we are. We make sure that they feel heard in every setting and opportunity that we can in the classroom and even potentially outside of the classroom. Rapport also has to do with respecting our students. This is especially important when it comes to correcting our students. It's always a delicate matter, especially when we're talking about correcting their language errors as their English language abilities are still developing. So how do we do that? Well, it's pretty important that we do it gently and unobtrusively, that we make sure that they don't feel belittled, that we don't say things like, come on, I've been over this 100 times, why aren't you getting this yet? Even if we might feel that way sometimes. Often language learning is a lengthy, it can take longer than we think that it should. When and how often do we correct our students, especially when it comes to errors? Well, truthfully, that really depends on the student. Some of them are very eager to have their mistakes corrected and really make sure they're getting accurate forms, especially some of our adult learners that will be true for. But most often it's important that we correct errors more when their mistakes are impeding communication and make it hard for that person to be understood, or when they're really repetitive errors and we see that they're starting to form some significant bad habits that we want to reorient toward the right direction. Another important part of developing rapport is really having a sense of even-handedness with our students. It's only human that we might have an affinity for some of our students more than for other students. Those students that are always coming to class eager and engaged and participating and being very friendly. It's normal that we would maybe have more of a preference for some of those students than for some of the students that may have a harder time with learner autonomy, who may not want to put their hands up as readily. But should we devote more time to that student, the one who is not having an easy time with their autonomy, or would that be a way that's not being so even-handed? Well, it's truly the case that making sure all of our students are engaged and learning is a mark of professionalism, and we have to maintain that impartiality. So often that means really drawing out some of those more reserved students and engaging them, and sometimes reining in those who are constantly putting their hands up and eager to participate, maybe more than is their fair share or helpful. So of course, teaching goes beyond having good relationships with our students. We need to perform a number of important tasks as well. So we're going to look at some of those things, and one of them is preparation. What does it mean to be a well-prepared teacher? Well, one thing that it means is planning out our learning outcomes ahead of time, having a game plan when you go into the classroom of how your lessons and activities are going to go and how you're going to use that time best toward your learning objectives. We will be spending a whole unit on lesson planning in detail later in the course, so we won't get too much into that now, but preparation is a huge important part of our tasks as teachers. Another one is keeping records. That can be a tiresome activity, but why is it valuable to keep records? Well, often it's especially important to be able to track our students' progress, to see where they started, and in measurable ways, how are they improving or not. It also is helpful to keep records of what lessons we've done, what activities we have tried, so that we can get a sense of so that we can have a record of what works or what doesn't in terms of our student engagement and in terms of their learning outcomes. And finally, an important task for us as teachers is to be reliable to our students. So this is really a kind of practice what you preach kind of imperative, that if we expect our students to show up to class on time and to turn their homework in promptly and to be consistent in their work, we really need to return that favor to them and be consistent in our timekeeping, in our grading and returning work to them, in our consistency, really modeling for them the behavior that we expect for them as learners. As teachers, we have to also develop a skill set that's going to enable us to be most effective. One of those skills is managing classes, and that involves things like thinking through your procedures, through your timing, through your groupings of students, the order of activities and the way the flow of the lessons will go, things like your seating patterns and how you utilize your space. And we'll be looking at a whole unit on managing the classroom as well. Another important skill that teachers need to have is matching tasks with groups of students. Some activities and approaches that worked well multiple times in the past may not work well with the next group. So every level 1 class is not the same. They actually each will be different. Maybe an activity that was well loved by multiple students you've had in the past falls flat. Maybe it's the time of day, maybe the students just aren't in the mood. It's hard to say, but we need to make sure that we are giving the right tasks to the right students and making sure that those tasks are at their proficiency levels as well. We also need to be really skilled in integrating a lot of variety into our lessons and into the activities that we have our students do. It really isn't helpful for us to keep offering them the same old, same old. Much of the value of a learning activity is its freshness. So even when we can't vary activity types, we can vary aspects about them. So maybe it's the learner's roles within that activity. If it's a discussion group, don't let the same student always be the note taker. Don't let the same student always be the discussion leader. Move those roles around. Or if you're using a textbook and the readings have comprehension questions, mix that up with some other content that you create, or use those comprehension questions differently, just to keep things interesting. This is especially important in response to attention spans. I mean, and that's true for adults as well as children, but certainly the younger your learners are, the greater is their need for variety. So in addition to rapport and skills and these other qualities, teachers really need a significant amount of knowledge, especially as teachers of English language learners. We need knowledge of the language system. This includes the importance of knowing the grammar system, the lexical system, the pronunciation features like sounds, stress, intonation. We'll look at a lot of those aspects, especially in depth in Chapter 5 in a future unit. And you'll also learn a lot on a lot of those parts of the language system in some of your other TESOL classes. But we need to understand how our grammar systems are used, how words change their shape depending on their grammatical function. We also need to know the difference between colloquial uses of language, of English, as well as formal language, or what are sometimes known as BICS and CALP. So our basic interpersonal communication skills, BICS, and our cognitive academic language proficiency, our CALP. And yeah, really simply, that's our everyday communication skills versus our academic and school language. Our goal ultimately is that our students be able to use both of those. And so we need to make sure that we know how to use both of those really well. So what if you don't know? What if students come to you and want an explanation of something in English, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, whatever, and you don't know how to explain it? Well, it seems like the most important thing that you can do is actually to be honest with your students and let them know, I'm not sure, I'm going to get back to you about that. And then you really got to follow through. You go and you do a little research and you figure out the answer and you come back, and that's actually really good modeling to show students that we, even as teachers, don't necessarily have all the answers, but we know how to look for them, and that can empower them to be actively engaged in looking up answers for themselves and seeking out how to understand language on their own. Teachers wear a lot of hats, and we have to adopt a lot of different roles in our capacity as teachers. So I'll talk about a few of them that Harmer discusses in the chapter. The first is the controller, sort of the person up in front who is delivering a lesson to the rest of the class and sort of controlling the activity and the behavior of the students. And that's appropriate for things like an information presentation, maybe like a grammar explanation, but it's not appropriate for the majority of the time that you spend in the classroom. It gives really little chance for student agency and engagement in their learning. Another role that we play are as prompters. We encourage students' responses, maybe especially as they're doing group and pair work. We may feed them bits of language or information that they need to keep communicating. We push them towards greater achievement in their language proficiency. A third role that we play often is the assessor. We're constantly gauging or assessing our students' progress. We're providing them feedback, and we're also encouraging them to self-assess and get a sense of, for themselves, where are they at, where are they going. Finally, we're often playing the role of a resource or a tutor, offering one-on-one support maybe before class or after class, by email if that's an appropriate method, and really kind of giving that additional individualized support to our students. It's also important to have resources that you can turn to as a teacher of English language learners. Sometimes that's books. You really should have at least one good grammar reference book and one good learner dictionary, usually a monolingual English dictionary for learners. If you teach ESL, or a bilingual dictionary can be helpful also for our bilingual classrooms. These can be online instead of in print, but sometimes it's nice to have print as well as just your one go-to resource that you can turn to as the authority on some of these questions that you might have about language. Websites can be great resources. There's so much out there now that are helpful for us as teachers of English language learners, but you really have to keep in mind that not all online sources are equally useful or accurate. You need to be discerning, because there's a lot of garbage out there that's just not true, describing English in ways that are not accurate, or are just not effective teaching tools and resources. One great one that I've enjoyed perusing and finding resources on is Colorín Colorado, which is a resource website for teachers of English language learners as well as bilingual teachers. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And sometimes textbooks that we use in class can be a good resource, but they can also be adapted and modified. And we're going to be looking at that a great deal in our unit on using course books in Chapter 11. So in addition to some of those resources, there's also classroom equipment that the teacher has at the ready. Historically it would have been pens, paper, chalk, and the board. That's been really replaced in many ways by things like a language laboratory, videos, projectors, websites, digital recording, smart boards, podcasts, blogs, web radio, a lot of the sort of social media oriented things that are available to language learners. These are all really useful and effective tools, but it's important to keep in mind that technology shouldn't be used for its own sake, but should be used to allow our students to do things that they otherwise couldn't. Really, all of these can be useful resources both inside the classroom and outside the classroom, but and it's incumbent upon us to explore these technologies to learn how to best exploit them for our own and our students' learning. But really, not every teacher needs to be equally proficient in everything. You can find those things that are really useful technologies for you, and allow others of your colleagues to utilize some of those technologies for them in ways that are more helpful in their classroom teaching. So having thought about important traits, tasks, skills, roles, knowledge of teachers, it's really important to sort of stop and ask ourselves, is teaching language an art, or is it more of a science? Think on that for a moment. Well, Harmer would suggest that perhaps it's both. In terms of our understanding and our ability to explain the language system and the technical skills that are required of teachers, it's really a science. But in terms of building rapport, the relationships the teacher has with students and cultivates between students, and the kind of nimble decision-making, adaptability, and creativity that's required in teaching, it's really also an art. So there's a little bit of both. Well, that is it for Unit 2, this lecture. So have a look at that task list for all of the details and activities that you'll be doing for the rest of Day 2, and I hope you enjoy thinking about teachers today.